Hello and welcome to Facebook Live. This is a program I do every so often, bringing together very interesting people to talk about topics that are timely. And I can't think of a more important topic for us to talk about now with such a contrast between the policies of the Trump administration and the record we know from Vice President Biden and the statements he's made in regards to his priorities as the next president of the United States. So our topic today is the next steps, environmental policy in the new administration. And I have two outstanding experts, I mean real experts today who really know this stuff. Heather McTeer Toney is the senior director at the Moms Clean Air Force. She's the former mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, and the former regional administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency in the Southeast. And she did a great job. It was not an easy task, and really understands how our environmental laws and regulations come together. And Tiernan Sittenfeld, who is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the League of Conservation Voters, and formerly with US PIRG, which is a group that has been one of the most effective groups in highlighting needs that we have to move forward as a nation. So I thank both of my guests for being here today. And let me just start off by this observation. Now, I'm going to be a little bit biased as to how I feel about this current administration. I serve on the Environment and Public Works Committee. I've been involved in the development of many of our programs, including those under the Clean Air and Clean Water, the Chesapeake Bay program, the climate issues, et cetera. And there have been good administrations and there have been not so good administrations. But every Congress, I've been proud that we've added to the commitment to our environment. We've done some positive progress to clean up our waters or clean up our air or act as a responsible global citizen in order to deal with the challenges we have, and no greater challenge than the challenge of climate change. This administration is the exception, because we've gotten some great progress under both Democrat and Republican administrations. So it hasn't been a partisan issue. The Chesapeake Bay program in Maryland, we had strong bipartisan support to create the Chesapeake Bay program. And we've had Democratic governors and Republican governors who have advanced our environmental agenda in our state. So this has been really disappointing. And I say that because we're trying to count up the number of anti-environmental rules and regulations that have been issued by this administration. You may have a better count than I do, but my staff, I think, stopped counting at about 100. So there's been a long list of what this administration has done. And of course, we know they pulled out of the climate agreements in Paris. In 2015, I led a group of 10 senators. We were in Paris. Very proud of the U.S. role, very proud of the Obama administration and pulling that together so we could get an agreement by every nation in the world to deal with this threat to our globe on climate change. Now to see that there's only one country in the world that's not part of that, and that's the United States of America. And by the way, our void in that has been filled by China. That's not something we should be very proud of. So it seems to me this topic is a very timely topic, and that is the environmental policies in a new administration. So, Heather, I'm going to start with you, if I might, as to what would be your priorities in giving advice to the Biden transition team as to where they should start with their priorities in dealing with the environmental agenda in the Biden administration. You're on mute. There you go. Still not, you're still, there you go. You should be now.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate you for all the work that you're doing for the great folks of Maryland. My family's from Baltimore and still is in Baltimore. So we greatly appreciate all of the work that you're doing.
I didn't know that. Oh, that's good.
Yeah. My grandmother and all of my cousins and aunts live right in the Baltimore metro area. And we appreciate, the work that you're doing on the committee to jump right into it, I think that it is very clear that the Biden-Harris administration got a mandate to work on climate as a result of this election. They talked about it, which was great. I was so excited to really hear them talk about good climate policy, talking about clean energy, and importantly, environmental justice. And I think that was certainly something that rose to the level of a top issue in this election. So I was thinking sort of back before the election, there were a number of studies that really showed that not only was climate change among the top issues, there was a Yale study that was done in April that showed that people of color were very likely, in fact, more likely to be concerned and vote on climate issues. And then post-election, there was a great analysis from Circle at Tufts University. That's the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. They showed that young voters really pushed Biden over the top, and their top issues were COVID, racism, and climate change. And then among Black and Brown young voters, the Biden lead was as high as 77% at one point. And they were very clear. Bold action on climate now, which is what I think we're seeing reflected in the Biden climate policy that they've listed. The Biden-Harris team has talked about environmental justice. They have talked about the importance of clean energy. So I think the first thing that has to be done is to make sure that they're really following up on those promises that were made throughout the election, because wonderful young progressive movements like Sunrise and 0 Hour and groups that really turned out young people to vote and really push that issue are still watching and want to make sure that this remains a top issue. They understand the science, understand the impact on the future, both physically and financially. So climate change is not just some far off thing in the future. It impacts infrastructure, job development, job growth, and what we see in our communities every day. And I think people really want to make sure that we not only really see that through in terms of sound climate policy and planning, but we do it in a very equitable fashion.
Oh, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Tiernan, your thoughts as to the advice you would give the transition team?
Well, first, I also want to join Heather in thanking you, Senator Cardin, for your incredible leadership. I live in DC, but I'm actually about a quarter of a mile from Maryland. So I feel like I personally and my family benefits from your leadership. It's really great to be here today with you and Heather. And I would say in terms of advice for the transition, well, one, clearly, as you noted, this past administration or soon to be past administration is clearly the most anti-environmental we've ever had by far. So there is so much to clean up, so much to undo, so much progress that needs to be made, given how high the stakes are, the fact that the climate crisis is already having devastating impacts across the country and the globe. But we're really encouraged by the great start that the transition is off to. Clearly, this President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, they ran on the climate crisis and on climate solutions. They won on climate. They're getting ready to govern on climate. And I think the way that they talk about the interwoven crises that we face of the coronavirus pandemic and economic inequality and racial injustice and the climate crisis is so important. And the solutions are really interrelated as well. And the Build Back Better proposal that they came out with this summer that really focuses on environmental justice, clean energy jobs, climate solutions is so important. So we think the transition is off to a really good start. Of course, people often say that personnel is policy. We're seeing them already bringing this real all of government or whole of government approach to the climate crisis. And that's really encouraging, whether it's seeing Brian Deese, longtime climate and conservation expert, who is now going to run the National Economic Council, or John Kerry as the new international climate envoy. So we think that the transition is already doing a lot of good work, and we are very optimistic about more exciting announcements to come, and really hope that they continue to govern as they've campaigned, because it's been really inspiring.
Both of you have mentioned environmental justice, and to me, that is one of the key moral imperatives we have. One of the really nice things that is happening is that as President-elect Biden's making his nominations for his cabinet, they're scheduling meetings for us. Most of them are virtual as part of the nomination process in the United States Senate. So I've had a chance to interview several of the nominees to date. not on the environmental side, but on other related fields of justice. And I must tell you, the passion that's coming out from these individuals on justice has been so refreshing to hear. Yes, I heard it during the campaign from the vice president, but you hear it from the people that he appointed. I don't have to bring these issues up. They bring them up to me in these interviews. So in regards to environmental justice, let me tell you, one of my major priorities in dealing with environmental justice. Clean air and clean water are important for everyone. Everyone needs a clean environment. But we find that in minority communities and in communities of poverty, the impact of damage to our environment is so much more severe, that it affects their lives so much more radically. And they don't have the options that other communities have. And when you look at where the greatest risks are located, you find they're in minority communities and in communities of poverty. So one of the areas that I hope we'll take a look at as we design these programs is to recognize that we really need to pay attention to environmental justice and recognize vulnerable communities and make a special effort in that direction. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I absolutely agree. Environmental justice is social justice. It is a social justice issue of our time. Climate justice and environmental justice, rectifying injustices from the past while at the same time preparing and ensuring that we have resources to have equitable communities, sustainability, and resiliency moving forward. And I think this takes shape in a number of different ways. So I've been really encouraged to hear the transition team and the Biden-Harris administration talk about having environmental justice and justice run throughout every single agency, not just putting the onus on one particular agency, but ensuring that everyone is talking together and really establishing this as a core value throughout the entire administration. When we look at what are the holes, the gaps, I think immediately to the science gap. This past administration that's about to go out has truly decimated the science and the data that's needed to make necessary decisions regarding the health impacts of environment, as well as ensuring that we're doing the right thing, preparing and moving forward. I've also been very disturbed to look at how we have seen enforcement happen throughout our communities, because it's very important that we are enforcing the rules that we have in an equitable fashion in a way that actually reduces pollution in communities. So there was a great study that was done by Dr. Francesca Domenici that actually showed how air pollution, even with our current regulations, are disproportionately enforced. In Black and Brown communities, the same enforcement is not taking place. And that's something that I think this administration can really look at and have as a place to resolve. And then, Senator, with what you talked about with respect to the regulations that we've seen that have happened, and you're right, I'm right along with you. Once we get to 100, it's like, oh my gosh, how much more can we deal with? At last count, I think we're at 105. But even recognizing with that even the regulations that the Trump administration has rolled back, they are disproportionately impacting communities of color. And so we must reckon with this in the next administration. I'm certainly hopeful that as they're talking about justice throughout every single agency, they're keeping in mind that these must be priority issues that are addressed, and that we have to put research, data, and science resources to them to ensure that we correct it moving forward.
And Tiernan, I want to get your response on this, but I'm going to broaden it a little bit. When we look at COVID-19 and you look at the impact of what communities have suffered the most, it's been the communities of color. The justice issues are pretty clear. When you look at lead poisoning and the communities that have suffered the most from lead poisoning, again, it's minority communities, those that do not have the same opportunities as others. And a lot of this is, of course, holding people accountable, holding corporations accountable for their deeds, for what they do is wrong. And of course, it takes courage to go up against big corporations. And that's what we hope we will see from the Biden administration. We certainly did not see that at all in the Trump administration. But if we want to take the greatest challenge we have, which does impact minority communities much more than the general population, it's the climate change issue. When we take a look at who have been devastated by hurricanes and by these wildfires, and you take a look at the floodings, et cetera, you see that there are communities that are trapped, and they're usually communities of color and low-income areas. So the challenge on social justice to me includes all of these issues, but I really am excited that we may be able to turn the page and get back where we need to be in regards to U.S. leadership on climate change. So, Tiernan,
Absolutely.
I'll take your on any of those points on the social justice agenda.
No, I couldn't agree more on all counts, both with what you said, Senator, and what Heather said. And I mean, it is clear that we can't have racial justice without environmental justice, without climate justice. All of these issues are so interwoven. It's horrifying that it's the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities that have been hit first and worst by toxic pollution for decades. And that absolutely has to stop. And I think the Trump administration has only exacerbated and made all of that so much worse. Clearly, the coronavirus pandemic has really laid bare so much of the racism in this country. And as awful as 2020 has been, I do think having this new start with the incoming Biden-Harris administration that has, over the course of the campaign, done a lot of listening and learning from environmental justice leaders across the country. I've had the privilege of getting to work through the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which I would encourage people to check out. The whole platform is online, but it really talks about the absolute necessity and imperative of centering environmental justice and anti-racism, racial justice, and equity in all of the policies that we pursue. And Heather talked about the importance of, as we take on this all-of-government approach to tackling the climate crisis, that environmental justice has to be front and center across all agencies and departments. It needs to be centered in the White House. I think on the Hill, we're seeing a lot more progress and focus on this across committees. Clearly, for you and other leaders in the Senate and in the House, we saw this in the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis Report, and then Senator Schatz led on the Senate report. But it can't be an afterthought. It has to be from the very get-go. We are putting environmental justice and the communities that have been left behind, that have been disproportionately impacted. They're at the table crafting the solutions. And when we think about even like the Build Back Better agenda and the $2 trillion of climate investment, 40% of that investment needs to go to environmental justice communities to start to right the legacy and the injustices that have continued for far too long. So this is something that clearly we made a bit of progress, but there's so much more to be done. And I'm really encouraged and optimistic by what's coming from the Biden-Harris transition team and the commitments that they've made, and really looking forward to working with you and so many others to make sure that we make the progress that is so important and so necessary.
So well said. John Kerry, former Secretary of State, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, former standard bearer for President of the United States on the Democratic Party, appointed to be the key person on climate in the Biden administration with a seat on the National Security Council. What does that say? Heather, I see your smile.
It says we're going back to being number one. It definitely says that the United States is serious about being a leader on climate, and that we are interested in forging relationships with our friends. You know, despite the past 4 years, we have friends. We have been a leader in this space, and we recognize the importance of that. And certainly, John Kerry is a leader in this space, has an international and a foreign policy record that speaks for itself. And, I think it's also important to recognize that being on the National Security Council here is a place of protecting America's families, because often we don't think about climate and the military, climate both domestically and internationally, how this impacts our military families that are both living here in the country on bases that are impacted by environmental hazards, but also overseas, what they're experiencing, what they're breathing, the water they're drinking, the land that they're on. So it's critical that we have these conversations for the security of our country. And I think that John Kerry is certainly a great leader in this place, and looking forward to seeing how this just continues to flourish.
So Tiernan, the Paris climate COP21 took place in 2015. And clearly we have seen some very positive actions taken by countries since 2015 that have made a difference. But we have seen the impact of the loss of U.S. leadership. As I mentioned earlier, China has stepped into that void, and that's not a positive statement. That doesn't bode well. And I think many of us looked at the Paris Accords as being historic, but a starting point, not an end point. That yes, we wanted to make sure there was compliance, but we needed to do more. And yes, we had to really work with the developing world to make sure we lived up to our commitments, to make sure that they were compensated for not doing what the developed countries did in abusing our environment, the Green Climate Fund. So the absence of U.S. leadership has really made it much more difficult for the global community to meet its obligations. What do you think John Kerry can do in this space?
Well, I think that there is a tremendous amount that John Kerry can do. And I absolutely agree with you and with Heather. The message that this sends to the world, that we are back, that we are determined to help lead again, is so important. And to have his skills, his expertise, his profile really speaks volumes to what a priority this is for the Biden-Harris administration. And I think that as you talked about, I mean, the Trump administration has taken us so far backwards at a time when we needed to be sprinting forward in terms of climate solutions and environmental justice. But at the same time, it really has been the Trump administration sort of isolated, well, along with some aiders and abettors on the Republican side in the Senate, of course. But we have seen states continue to make such great progress to say we are still in. So we went from a few years ago where only 1 in 5 people in this country lived in a state that was on track to get to 100% clean renewable energy to 1 in 4 a couple of years ago. Then in the 2018 elections, there were so many state legislators, new members of Congress, incoming governors who ran with the commitment to 100% clean energy. They won on that. We've now seen significant progress in at least 13 states to get to a clean energy economy once and for all. And we're now at the point where 1 in 3 people in this country lives in a state that is on track to get to 100% clean energy. So we've seen progress at the state level. We've seen municipal progress. We're seeing, as you noted, other countries moving ahead. Obviously, the marketplace is in many cases racing forward. So I think it's really the Trump administration that has been so off track and so misguided, and just clearly doing what might be best for the polluters, but what's worst for our health and our environment and our planet. So we're really encouraged that Secretary Kerry will be able to marshal all of this different progress and to up the level of ambition at all levels of government and, of course, around the world. So, I think it's really exciting. I know he's going to be working closely, of course, with the other climate leaders across the administration. We're looking forward to more of those getting named, and looking forward to a White House lead on climate to help coordinate a lot of this work. So we feel like we've lost so much time with the Trump administration. At the same time, the solutions are there. The clean energy industry has been hit hard by the pandemic. We really do need to extend the clean energy tax credits for wind and solar and efficiency in electric vehicles. So thank you for your leadership on that and so much else. But I feel like we can turn the page on this awful administration and really move forward so quickly on the progress that is necessary, that the science requires.
Well, that's probably the only silver lining here, is that because of what has been done by the Trump administration, President Biden, I think, is going to be able to deliver a lot of progress in the United States to show that we are taking steps and not just, we're taking care of business at home before we're asking the international community to step up and do more to protect our environment, to protect us from the danger of climate change. Both of you have mentioned executive actions through either executive order or rules and regulations, et cetera, and that we can't count how many he did. I was told yesterday they finalized another one of these bad rules on the clean air. I read through it when it was out there and I commented on it. It is unbelievable. It basically puts anyone who wants to come up with one of these rules on the defensive to demonstrate why you couldn't do this in the private sector and what is the specific gain you're going to get. And really, you don't get to do a cost benefit analysis. What you really are doing is being on the defensive as to whether there should be any regulations here or not. We just trust the private sector to keep clean air. That's just one example. So my question, I guess, to both of you is that President Biden will have that pen on January the 20th. What action should he take that he doesn't need Congress in order to try to put us on the right path and to do this in a way that shows his priorities on his administration? So what are the early executive orders do you think he should be looking at, either reversing what President Trump did or initiating in the area of our environment? Heather, any thoughts?
I think we're all in agreement about Paris, and we know that that's an immediate. But on day one, as soon as he's finished signing for Paris, immediately directing the legal staff and teams to begin holding in abeyance any litigation on any rule that's currently been put forward in the courts, to just stop it and just put an immediate halt, so that the new administration in the various agencies from DOJ, EPA, wherever there is existing litigation, can begin to take an assessment and then determine what and how we can use the Clean Air Act, use all the resources that we have currently to go back and make a decision as to how we need to use these things moving forward. We do have resources that we can use. We should use them to the best of our ability. And I think that includes everything from the Clean Air Act to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We have a plethora of things that we've got to immediately put to work. But I think, Senator, as you said, we have to be able to do stuff on day one, absolutely, when we get in there. And then another point to this about those rules, at Moms Clean Air Force, we have been on the front lines for every single time and every single rule that they have tried to reverse. We've had moms who have been at everything from OMB hearings to submitting comments and holding accountable. This past administration, I think, even does go into the next administration in terms of how we reverse those rules and prioritizing what we can do when. It's going to be a heavy lift for everyone to jump in, but some stuff absolutely has to be done on day one. And I think holding those things in abeyance should be really, really close to the top.
Good point.
I agree with Heather. She mentioned a lot of really important day one priorities. Of course, there's so much pent up need for action and progress. So I have a few more to add. There's, of course, a lot of really dirty, dangerous, harmful projects that the Trump administration has been pushing even in their final days. So we clearly need the Biden administration to very quickly protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They need to reject projects or dirty, dangerous pipelines like the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, need to get going to block the Dakota Access Pipeline. We would love to see, and they've already committed to protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. So there's a lot to do right away, both in terms of designating, this may not be all exactly on day one, if only there were more than 24 hours, but to get going on protecting our critically important lands and oceans, which are important for so many reasons, including being part of the climate solution, but we also need to expand equitable access to public lands. We need to move forward with designating new national monuments, undoing rollbacks like to Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. And then, of course, pretty early on, we need to get going with new rulemaking for clean cars, for methane, for appliance standards, for power plants. So many of these common sense public health and environmental protections that were wildly popular, that had been were working during the Obama administration, and then really, obviously, just to sort of pad polluter profits, the Trump administration rolled them back. So that has to change. So there's so much to do, and we can't wait to get started.
If I can piggyback on
Sure.
just one of those things, because I think that this is outlining exactly what we need to be doing and talking about and what people are really interested in. Because we're in this process, the Biden-Harris administration also is responsible for just restoring the trust in our federal government, restoring the trust that we are relying on the science and we're making the best decisions on behalf of the American people. And an important part of that is including the American people. So as we're talking through these areas of rulemaking that we have to do and really seeing how they impact all parts of our country, something that this past administration did that absolutely we cannot do moving forward in the Biden-Harris administration is to exclude the American public. We have to make sure, and I think, from our organization at Moms, we've certainly been a part of this process, but being there for comments, encouraging interagency work within the federal government to be able to not only leverage our own resources, but make sure that we're really talking and getting and inviting the American folks to the table. We've all been excluded for so long. That has to be a top priority.
Heather, I agree with you. The NEPA process, that's the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA process for public comment is paramount part of our environmental laws. And the Trump administration ignored and weakened that process to the point that it was non-existent. And we have to restore that because transparency and comment is critically important as decisions are being made that affect our community. We must make sure we have that type of community support. My guest today on Facebook Live, Heather McTeer Toney, who's the Senior Director of Moms Clean Air Force and the former mayor of Greenfield, Mississippi, and has roots in Maryland. I'm glad to hear that also. And Tiernan Sittenfeld, who is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the League of Conservation Voters, one of the great organizations in our community that's done so much to protect our environment. Both of you have mentioned the energy issue, and candidate Biden talked about a goal of 100% clean energy economy and net zero emissions by 2050. How do we get there? You talked about some of the tax code provisions. You've already talked about the efficiencies of our automobiles in transportation, but what changes would you recommend? And Tiernan, I'll start with you because you mentioned some of the specific tax provisions I really like. So how do we get to an energy policy for clean energy and a green economy? We got you on mute, I think. Get you. Maybe on our end. Okay, there you go.
Got it. Thanks. Clearly, Senator, we both agree we absolutely have to double down on clean, renewable energy. That's why it's so vitally important that we renew and extend the clean energy tax credits for wind and solar and energy efficiency and electric vehicles, among others. But you mentioned the Build Back Better plan that President-elect Biden ran and won on. And in addition to committing to 100% clean energy economy by 2050, he also committed to 100% clean electricity by 2035. So that is vitally important. We have got to get going on that. It's also really important that we make our buildings more energy efficient, that we are focused on sustainable agriculture. Of course, there has been so much progress on clean cars. We've got to really get back to that. We've got to start with renewing the California or bringing back the California waiver that's been so important in enabling them to set more fuel efficient standards for cars and trucks and really help lead the nation that way. And then it's so important, and you touched on this, that we hold fossil fuel companies accountable. for their pollution, for the damage and the harm that they continue to wreak on our environment, particularly impacting communities that can least afford it, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and low-income communities. But also, I think there's so much to be done in the space of fossil fuel accountability. And, I was really happy to see in the news yesterday, the New York Times is divesting from their fossil fuel investments. Clearly, the markets are going to have a very important role to play in that. So this is not an either or solution. I think it's yes, and we need to continue to plow forward with transitioning to clean energy once and for all at the local level, the state level, and of course at the federal level and in the marketplace. So we do think, again, clearly the stakes have never been higher. The crisis, whether it's the most devastating wildfires we've ever experienced in California and across the West, or the flooding, or the more frequent and intense storms and hurricanes, the consequences are devastating, but the solutions are there. It's just about having the political will. And that's why we're so grateful to have leaders like you who are fighting so hard for these solutions.
Heather, you want to add on the energy portfolio?
Sure, I absolutely agree with what Hammond said, and I think that these are the areas and spaces where we can show where clean energy works for everybody, whether you are in a rural community or urban community. I'll give you a great example, looking at electric school buses, just the opportunity for children to be able to ride to school in a clean vehicle, but at the same time reducing the amount of pollution that goes through neighborhoods where children typically ride buses to school, which are often more impoverished communities. That just helps us to not only take and get to the clean energy place where we're trying to reach, but at the same time, improving the health impacts for people. I think it's very important for us to show how these benefits are not just one-sided, but they are multifaceted. And as we all come together to help us to get to clean energy, whether it's through school buses, trucks, cars, and I'm really excited to see even the auto industry begin to reverse themselves about how they want to continue on the path of making sure they're getting to electric vehicles. We've got to support our states, our governors, our mayors who have already started on this initiative, but show where this is a multi-agency approach and we have the opportunity to leverage. One of the best programs I remember as a mayor was a program where there were EPA funds, Department of Transportation funds, and HUD funds that would help a community to not just tackle one particular area of a problem with respect to resiliency, but was multifaceted. And people in the community, they understood it and they really got it, because it was not just some far-fetched idea of a electric vehicle that they couldn't afford, but it was showing them how this is creating jobs in a community, creating and putting money into their pocketbook, and then making them healthier at the same time. And I think as we talk about clean energy, we've got to talk about it in a way that approaches all communities and gets us buy-in from all communities, and it makes this happen that much faster.
I'm so glad that Heather brought up the importance of electrifying the school bus fleet in particular. That is so important. It's actually something that our partners at CHISPA have been very focused on in states around the country, and we've been proud to work with moms and Heather on that. And it's actually something that Vice President-elect Harris introduced a bill in the Senate to electrify the school bus fleet. But that is something that I think is really important. And of course, I have my kids' artwork in the background, but clearly so much of this is about future generations and the moral imperative of leaving a better world for all of our children.
And we do hope that we'll have different areas of progress on this front. On the Senate Finance Committee, on the tax code, I know that Senator Wyden is very interested in putting together an energy package within any tax bill that moves forward that would reinforce the commitment to a green economy and to get to that net zero emissions by 2050. So I think there's a commitment on electricity by an earlier date. I think there really is this is doable. Science tells us we can get there. And by the way, we're going to have an administration that believes in science. And I must tell you, I can understand an administration trying to make political decisions. What I don't understand is how they could try to compromise the science groups that are in the agency, giving them advice to at least let them operate and give the best advice based upon science. And that was compromised also during the Trump administration. And I think you'll see a big change to that under President Biden. Build Back Better. You both have talked about Build Back Better. So let me just say something optimistic about transportation. It was in May of last year that the Environment and Public Works Committee, which chairman is a Republican, passed out the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill by a unanimous vote. And what was remarkable about that, it had some very strong environmental provisions. It had electric charging stations as part of our commitment on surface transportation. It had adaptation and resiliency to deal with the realities of climate change. We had alternative transportation programs that allowed for pedestrian paths and bicycle paths so that we could get places without having to use our automobiles. It really was a pretty, and it had a strong, we didn't have it into our bill, but it was a strong provision for public transit would have been added to it because it was part of the overall size of the program. So that's good news. And now that's a start for Building Back Better. And we now have COVID-19, and I say that because there will be a need for an economic growth plan in addition, and there's no better place to deal with that in infrastructure. We recognize that, but we want to make sure the infrastructure is smart for our environment. Reasons to be optimistic, I think. I really do. Heather?
I think it's absolutely reasons to be optimistic because there's so many ways we can see that multiply in the future. The Build Back Better plan is exciting because it talks about those things that matter to our families, making sure that we're not only protecting our environment, but that we're creating jobs. As Tiernan said, just, thinking about the future, and certainly transportation is a key factor in that. And when we look at our urban centers, transportation centers, and the connection between environmental justice communities that have disproportionately been impacted by pollution, transportation pollution, you see where this becomes quite the important topic to not only make sure we're funding and researching, but as you just mentioned, coronavirus, understanding the impacts there make it that much more important for us to address now. I think about the stories that I've heard from moms that are living in places like Houston, Texas, where they are sitting in the middle of petrochemical facilities. They're in communities that are surrounded by heavy transportation pollution, yet they have to shelter in place at home under a cloud of pollution in the midst of a pandemic. Looking at these types of experiences that American families have across this country lets us know that this is not just an optional thing, this is mandatory for us to figure out how to connect our regulations and enforcements to transportation, to health and well-being for all of our families. And I think the Build Back Better plan gets it and is really looking at ways that we can fund and make these resources available to people while at the same time creating job growth and future development that we can depend on.
Tiernan, you mentioned the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I'd like to expand that a little bit. Let me get a little bit parochial with the Mid-Atlantic, which is of particular interest to me in the Chesapeake Bay. But offshore drilling, our public lands being opened up for more drilling. This, despite the fact that we already have a substantial amount of petroleum in this country, and we are basically energy independent, and there's certainly ways that we can expand in renewables to deal with our future needs. So tell me the risk factors in the Arctic. Tell me the risk factors in offshore drilling. Tell me the risk factors in opening up more public lands, and what are the alternatives for those who say we've got to get energy from all sources as much as we possibly can?
Right. All excellent questions. And I mean, I think it's clear the risks are massive. The upsides are almost non-existent, if at all, and completely, as you point out, unnecessary. And, I think I live, as I said, in DC. I live close to Rock Creek Park. And I feel like for me, being able to get out into the outdoors is, especially during Corona, has been such a source of comfort and solace, and getting to go out there with my children. And I think we're at a time when we need to be providing more access, and we especially need to be providing more equitable access. Clearly, we've seen some very disturbing moves from the Trump administration, in addition to all of the horrific efforts to exploit our public lands for more drilling. And we've also seen, whether it was, Trump directing the park police to go after peaceful protesters in Lafayette Park, or some of the just efforts to make it harder for people to access our public lands across the country. So we need to be protecting public lands. We need to make them part of the climate solution. And that's, again, you talked about the threats to the Arctic refuge. Well, let's see, it's home to the Porcupine River caribou herd, home to so many migratory birds, and also and critically important to Indigenous people and to their subsistence way of life. So there are so many reasons that the Arctic refuge is sacred. It is pristine. It needs to stay that way, regardless of whether anyone, ever who doesn't live there gets to go there. It is so important as to the wildlife and to the people who live there. And for our coasts, I mean, of course, those of us who are lucky to live on the East Coast or the West Coast, or even whether it's the Great Lakes, these are precious bodies of water, and we can't afford. I mean, I think we're all well remember the disaster of the BP Gulf Coast Horizon disaster from, I guess, 11 years ago now. We cannot afford to have more of our precious coasts be despoiled. And it's not just an environmental issue or about keeping these places pristine. There's also coastal recreation and tourism. It's vital to the economy. So there are so many reasons that we absolutely need to transition to this clean energy economy. And back to Build Back Better, because we're so excited about that as well. But there really is a chance to rebuild our economy in a way that is more equitable and just, and really focuses on putting people back to work and enabling them to live in pollution-free communities. So we think it's a great vision and a great set of goals and commitments that President-elect Biden has made. And we're so excited to get to work with the incoming administration to make that a reality.
Thank you. Heather, do you want to add in regards to the drilling issues? Or?
I think it's critically important for us to understand the importance, as Tiernan just laid out, of these natural resources to our country, but to the world. The role that they play in our world is important, both from an economic standpoint, but also from the importance that they have to the Indigenous communities that live in these spaces, and just the value that they bring. I'm from the South, so I grew up with all of these wonderful Southern euphemisms. You don't use up all of your stuff. And that's what I think about often, and just being, again, a Southerner, but also a person of faith. There's some things you have to make sure that you're protecting and keeping, and this is a critical, important part of that. So I totally agree. And also, as a mother, I think it's important for us to teach our children to protect and to care for, that we don't use up everything. Just because it's there does not mean that it's for us to go and use until there is absolutely no more left. And certainly these are spaces that must be protected in that way as well.
I'm going to borrow that. You don't use all your stuff.
That's good. That's good. I like it. So as a senator from Maryland, I'm going to bring up the Chesapeake Bay. It is iconic to our way of life. We're so proud of what it means to our state. It's the largest estuary in our hemisphere. And I think it's very appropriate to bring it up, particularly this week, when we lost one of the great champions of the architect of the Chesapeake Bay program, Paul Sarbanes. Senator Sarbanes, I was honored to follow him in the United States Senate. We started in public life together in the Maryland General Assembly many years ago. And then I followed him with intervening Barbara Mikulski in the House of Representatives before coming over to the United States Senate in the same seat that he held in the House. And he was, when we talk about environmental justice, when we talk about justice, when we talk about integrity, there's no finer person than Paul Sarbanes. He was just a role model for all of us in public service. And I think Steve Sachs said it best in the Baltimore Sun letter to the editor, where he said he gave all of us who serve in public life a good name. So we miss him. There's no question about it. We extend our condolences to his family and to his son, John, who we serve with in the Maryland delegation. But the Chesapeake Bay is a unique body of water. It doesn't cleanse itself very well. It's somewhat of a self-contained body. And if we get an oil spill, because we allow offshore drilling off the mid-Atlantic, even though there is not purported to be any significant reserves there, but if we allow the exploration and we get a spill, the currents are such that it is a really high probability that it'll end up in the Chesapeake Bay and cause irreparable damage to that incredibly valuable national treasure. It's been declared a national treasure by successive administrations for many years. So we have made progress in this Congress in protecting the Chesapeake Bay. We've done that with an administration that wanted to zero out the federal partnership in the Chesapeake Bay and do so many other things that were detrimental to the Bay. And I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their leadership in advancing the partnership. And along with Senator Capito, my colleague from West Virginia, we were able to get a stronger partnership authorization bill passed this year for the Chesapeake Bay. So we've made some progress, but you've got to pay attention to it all the time. And that when we talk about offshore drilling, or we talk about the clean water or even clean air, because the pollutants from the air very much enter into the Chesapeake Bay, it has a direct impact on the Chesapeake Bay itself. So we're going to do everything we can to protect the Bay. We have a strong bipartisan coalition. We have the Governor Hogan, his administration in Annapolis have been very strong on protecting the Bay. We're going to continue to do that. But I can tell you it's going to be a lot easier with an administration that believes in science, believes in protecting our environment, and believes that we have responsibilities to leave our community and our environment a little bit better for the people who follow us. So both of you, well, I guess, Tiernan, you live in this area, so you're one of the stakeholders of the Chesapeake Bay. And we have so many of the tributaries that go through our community, and they're really cleaning it up, but it really requires a continuous effort to make this a reality.
I couldn't agree more with everything that you just said. And thank you again for your tremendous leadership, for the Chesapeake, for our waterways across the country, for standing strong and leading the charge against the Trump administration's efforts to gut the Clean Water Rule. Obviously, PFAS contamination is such an important water issue. So again, thank you and kudos to you on all counts. It is absolutely outrageous that the Trump administration tried to zero out all of our regional water programs. And as you said, I think with this new administration, there's just such a great opportunity to turn the page and to really double down and invest even more in the Chesapeake and in our treasured waters across the country. Because of course, I mean, what is more important for all of us than that?
And Heather, we have a chance. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Please.
No, I was gonna amen. Nobody wants a polluted crab cake. I know for a fact from my family that's there. That is so important. But this is where quality insurance, this is where science matters. This is where it's important for us to have funding for land management and to ensure that we have things like good watershed plans and watershed improvement plans. These are the places where it matters. And like in the Chesapeake area, and how critical it is to the ecological culture of the area, but also the economic culture of the area. When we begin to see this, how we relate to these issues across our country, I see the Chesapeake and the value of making sure that that is protected, just like I see the value of the Mississippi River that runs right through my hometown, the same way that we look at the Great Lakes, the same way that we have to protect all of our waters. They are a part of our system, as we just discussed, of protecting again, the ecology, but also the economy of our communities. So I absolutely agree. And I want to make sure that I can have my crab cakes when I come home to visit my grandmother.
I just want you to know that I know you're from Mississippi. I know that you were EPA, a regional administrator in the Southeast. I was going to send you a letter of complaint because there are restaurants in your region that put on their menu a Maryland crab cake that is defaming our Maryland crab cakes. They don't know how to make them down there. So please make sure they don't use our name in vain.
Senator, my mother would co-sign that letter with you because she refuses to eat a crab cake that is not a authentic Maryland crab cake. So either she's going to make it herself or she will publicly complain. And I hope my mother is watching this.
Good for your mother. I appreciate that. One last point, if we have time, I want to give you another opportunity we have here on a vehicle, and that's the Water Resources Development Act, the WRDA Act. It looks like we have a chance actually to pass it in this Congress, and it does contain some provisions that we were able to get in there that are going to be good for resiliency in our on the water projects through the Army Corps. But I just really urge us as we look at Build Back Better, it's more than just transportation, which gets most of the attention, and energy, which gets a lot of attention, and broadband, which is desperately needed. But it's also our water projects, which people don't see, but have a major impact. We're wasting a lot of water in this country. We have an inefficient system that uses more energy than it should use. And we really need to make sure we pay attention to our water projects, whether they're the Army Corps projects or our drinking water projects. We're not going to get the drinking water done this Congress. We're going to have to come back to it in the next Congress. But these are areas that I would hope as we concentrate on trying to influence the Biden administration on our environment, that we also include our water infrastructure, making sure that it is consistent with our environmental commitments. Any thoughts on water?
That is so important. I'm so glad that you brought that up. I mean, especially now during the pandemic, when so many people are in economic crisis, immediately we need to ensure that there are no water shutoffs. But we absolutely need to ensure that all people in this country, regardless of where they live, their zip code, their race, all people in this country deserve clean water to drink. That is a right, not a privilege. And so we do need to invest in the clean water infrastructure that is so necessary for all of our communities. So that, I think, is a vitally important part of Build Back Better. I'm confident that the incoming administration will agree and that there's an opportunity for us to make a lot of progress on that.
Absolutely. I agree. It is an area, Safe Water Drinking Act. Absolutely. We must look at that's a serious justice space and area. None of us will forget Flint. I think it's important to recognize the impacts that it has on communities, but also the opportunities, again, for development and sustainability in those same communities. Wastewater treatment plants have to have infrastructure development. Clean water and drinking systems have to constantly be upgraded. And it's very difficult to do that if you're a mayor of a community that doesn't have the tax base to be able to do it. Just being able to comply with existing regulations, the mayors and city leaders all across this country often have their hands tied and don't understand how the federal government is expecting them to be in compliance when they have no tools. And this is a wonderful opportunity for the Biden-Harris administration to show we are here to help, to not only ensure that your communities have clean access to water, that we are ensuring that we don't have communities that are falling behind, but also to put communities on the path to ensuring resiliency and climate infrastructure while creating jobs in communities. So I'm very excited about this.
Well, Heather, thanks for mentioning that. And I should point out that one of the provisions we're working on in regards to the Water Resources Development Act is affordability, so that every family can have affordable clean water. And my partner in that is the senator from Mississippi, Roger Wicker. So it's a bipartisan effort, and we're working together to try to deal with that. It is something that, unfortunately, is becoming more and more expensive. The water, the options of the local governments in regards to improvements in their water system is very limited. So we are looking at additional ways that we can help finance those programs so that all communities can have safe, clean, affordable drinking water, and they treat wastewater in the proper manner. Let me, as I said, we could go on for days on this subject. It is one that is bringing smiles to all of our faces. Is something I'd rather do than some of the debates we're having on the floor of the Senate these days. But let me thank both of our guests today, true experts on the environment, and are going to be extremely active as we go forward under the Biden administration. Heather McTeer Toney, who's the Senior Director for Moms Clean Air Force, and Tiernan Sittenfeld, who's the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the League of Conservation Voters. So thank you both. You were fabulous. You really helped me get through the subject and try to tee up what we can expect under the Biden administration. And thank you all for joining us today on Facebook Live.
Thank you so much, Senator. Thank you, Heather.
Senator.
That was perfect. You guys are great.